Hi everyone and welcome back to Scarlet Sprites. With the Super Nintendo Classic now on shelves and thankfully more of these in gamers' hands than the NES Classic, I thought it'd be fun to take a look at what a Volume 2 edition of the Super Nintendo Classic might look like. So Nintendo has already announced that they're going to be re-releasing the NES Classic Edition into stores in summer of 2018. I can definitely say that switching the shell to something like this and altering even one or two games for that would definitely make collectors like myself probably buy a second one. So even though it's highly unlikely we would see the NES 101 design make it onto a NES Classic Edition outside of a third-party case being produced, I still thought that was a cool idea. Which brings me back to the original idea for this video, which is coming up with a list of games that I would like to see on a Volume 2 edition of the Super Nintendo Classic. And since we're already talking about redesigning case shells, why not go with this if you're doing Volume 2? I thought that would be cool. Alright, without further ado, I'm going to rip through my list of games that I would like to see on a Super Nintendo Classic Edition Volume 2. So there are no real rules to this outside of none of the games that I'm about to list are on the existing Super Nintendo Classic. But I am really interested in hearing where I've gone wrong, games I might have missed or are worth a mention, and by all means, please list your games in the comments section. I'd love to see what everyone else's lists look like for a potential Volume 2. Alright, number one, let's just get it out of the way right off the bat. Chrono Trigger. We all know we want to see it. It would be great. We've got a ton of other RPGs on the Super Nintendo Classic Edition, but this is one notably missing. It'd be great to see it hit a Volume 2. Next up is another no-brainer, Pilot Wings. How this didn't make it onto the original Super Nintendo Classic Edition lineup, I don't know, but it is really a marquee of the Mode 7 graphics that launched when the system launched, and I definitely think it should be on Volume 2. Next up on my list is Final Fight. Since we didn't get a beat 'em up on the Super Nintendo Classic Edition, I feel like this is worthy of Volume 2. It's definitely one of my favorite arcade games of all time. I know the Super Nintendo version pales in comparison to the Sega CD. We don't get to play as Guy, there's no two-player simultaneous support, but I still think it belongs there. Number 4 on my list is where wishes and dreams come into play, and also legal disputes when you go with NBA Jam. Definitely a licensing issue, probably would never happen. The only way I could see this happening is maybe if they went with just the city names, removed all the player names, and for me, I've said in other videos before that I actually like that. I like the more generic, the game creates the world for you as opposed to throwing in real players. For NBA Jam and games like this, I definitely could see the argument being that part of the fun is playing with these real life players but with super abilities, so I get all that. NBA Jam was just such a great game when it launched and hit home consoles that I would love to see it on a Super Nintendo Classic. It's also a great two-player game which is really in the spirit of the system. Number 5 on my list is Killer Instinct. What a great fighting game from Nintendo and Rare. This was a true contender up against the likenesses of Street Fighter and the Mortal Kombats of the time, and a great game in its own right. Definitely deserves to be on Volume 2. And right on the heels of that, I'm just going to throw in another fighting game. Mortal Kombat 2 from Midway. I don't even know if I need to say anymore. Another fantastic game. Some people argued whether or not that should have subbed in for Street Fighter on the Super Nintendo Classic lineup. Maybe it was a licensing issue, who knows. But definitely deserves to be on Volume 2 because this is all fantasy and we can do whatever we want. Number 7 on my list is a game that I really didn't play much of growing up. I rented it a few times. I saw what the buzz was about, but it's not really a genre that's in my wheelhouse. SimCity, definitely deserving to be on Volume 2. Number 8's another no-brainer for me. We already got Donkey Kong Country on the initial lineup. Why not do Donkey Kong Country 2 on Volume 2? Number 9's a game I'm a huge fan of. It's a Konami shooter that I think Contra 3 probably bested, but this is by no means any less spectacular. I had a lot of fun playing it in the arcades, and I cherished it when it came to the Super Nintendo, Sunset Riders. Alright, number 10. Here's where we start getting a little controversial and we might have some discrepancies in opinion, but I'm definitely going to throw out Blackthorn. It's a fantastic side-scroller. If you've never taken the time to play it, it's definitely worth it, deserving of Volume 2. Number 11. Going back to the roots of video games when you're essentially just bouncing a ball back and forth between two players, Super Tennis. This was actually a really good game and one that was overlooked because, well, it's tennis. But it was really a great game. Again, plays to that whole two-player concept that the Super Nintendo Classic tends to promote. Definitely deserving of Volume 2 in my opinion. Alright, number 12, I'm going to throw out R-Type 3, The Third Lightning. This is a game that I actually always appreciate the visuals of, and the audio is not bad either. I really like the soundtrack for this. I think it's deserving of a spot. For number 13, I'm going to throw out another Konami game, two-player, Zombies Ate My Neighbors. I know it sounds a little crazy. I've always enjoyed playing this game, and it's deserving of a spot on my personal Volume 2. For number 14, I'm going to throw out Gradius 3. I know we just talked about R-Type 3, but this was another launch title, and for me personally, this makes the list. Number 15, Demon's Crest. I know this is another Capcom game. You're starting to see a theme. Yes, I do actually really like Capcom games and Konami games, which I know most of you do. This seems to be a game that was overlooked in its time, but later developed more of a cult following. Very expensive if you try to pick up a complete in-box copy of this right now. It'd be great to see it hit a Volume 2. Number 16, I'm going to continue the theme of Capcom and shooters and throw out UN Squadron. It's definitely one of my favorite games on the Super Nintendo. I always liked how you could pick your pilot, you could upgrade your airplane, and then you weren't on this set path. You could kind of pick your missions as you progress through the game, which I always really enjoyed. Number 17, ActRaiser. I don't know that a whole lot more needs to be said. It's worth playing this game to hear the soundtrack alone. Phenomenal 16-bit music. Number 18, Joe and Mac 2. It's a game I never spent a lot of time with, but later in my college days I picked up and was able to play and enjoy. Definitely worth trying out if you haven't played it. Number 19, the visual masterpiece, at least at the time, Out of This World. It truly was at the time a movie that you were involved in. The cinema scenes and the storytelling I always thought were great in this. The controls leave a little bit to be desired and maybe off-putting, but just give it a little bit of time. They're by no means snappy, but they're also not Dragon's Lair bad. So give it a shot. I actually finished this when I was a kid, and it remains one of the games that I think of when I think of the Super Nintendo. Number 20, I'm going to throw all licensing concerns aside and go with that rare game that actually is a movie and a video game, and it's good. Super Star Wars. The trilogy as a whole isn't too bad, and you might even want to go with Jedi, which might be the better game, but one of those games is definitely deserving of the roster spot. And finally, since the initial lineup contained 21 games, with Star Fox 2 being the Super Effects chip game that they snuck in there, I'm going to throw in my own Super Effects chip game and go with Stunt Racers for my final roster spot. It's a multiplayer game and kind of fits overall with the spirit of the Super Nintendo Classic, so I feel strong enough about it that I don't mind giving it the final spot. So thanks for listening to my top 21 games for a Volume 2 edition of the Super Nintendo Classic Edition. I know we're not going to get this machine, and certainly a lot of the games I mentioned would never be able to be licensed anyway, but with Hakchi inevitably getting updated or another tool coming along, we will be able to put whatever we want on this machine. You know it's only a matter of time, so go ahead and leave in the comments what your Volume 2 edition of the Super Nintendo Classic would look like, or just tell me what games you're already queuing up in anticipation of being able to load your own games onto the device. As always, thanks for watching everybody. Don't forget to like the video. I'll catch you all next time.